Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Well, hello and welcome to our listeners. My name is Holly Weinkauf. I am the owner of Red Balloon Bookshop in St. Paul, Minnesota, and one of the readers for the Summer-Fall 2024 Indies Introduced program. Today, I'm so happy and honored to be talking with debut author Johanna Taylor. Her young adult graphic novel is The Ghostkeeper. And as you would expect from this title, it is a ghost story with plenty of ghosts and creepy scenes, but it is also very much a sweet, feel-good story and so much more. So before we begin talking with Johanna about her book, let me first tell you a little bit about her. Johanna Taylor is an illustrator, concept artist with a BFA in animation, and a graphic novelist living in Salt Lake City. She is passionate about tabletop RPGs, or role-playing games, comics, and exploring topics of mental health through storytelling. Johanna also enjoys video games and reading Victorian classic novels over tea with her cat, Raven. And I think I can actually see Raven on our screen. So welcome to Johanna and Raven. And also congratulations on your novel.
Thank you so much, Holly. Thank you for having me. And Raven says hello too, but she's asleep. She does not want to be perceived right now.
All right. Well, I just mentioned that you have your degree in animation, and I know you've been animating and illustrating for a while, but this is your first graphic novel. So at what point did you start thinking about writing and creating a graphic novel?
You know, it wasn't something that I had planned to do from the outset. It kind of snuck up on me. I got a degree, my BFA in animation. I originally was studying storyboarding, which is the art of basically doing a rough draft of all of the camera shots of an episode of TV or a movie or a cartoon. And it basically is something you hand to the animators and say, this is going to be the sequence of events and this is how they're going to unfold. This is the angle you're going to choose. This is which character is going to stand where in the scene and who's talking, etc. So originally I wanted to do that, but I ended up working too hard during my school years and I injured my hand. I ended up with a repetitive strain injury. And so I had to step way back and kind of take a little bit of a break and do a little bit of a pivot, because storyboarding is a very, very intense job. You do thousands of drawings a week, a month, because they'll have tight turnarounds, especially in TV. So I realized I needed to take a bit of a slower pace. And while I was recovering, I fell back in love with illustration and decided that I wanted to kind of do more of that instead. And so during that time, I played a lot of role-playing games. I played a lot of D&D, and that was kind of what inspired me to keep creating and to draw stuff for myself. Was I would draw my character, my friends' characters, all the little stories they got into. And I think that fed directly into the idea of, I love illustration, but I also love creating stories that are behind the illustrations, and having people be able to look at something that I drew and be able to kind of absorb exactly what each character is thinking, what they're feeling, what the situation is that they're seeing play out in the illustration, almost like a screen capture from a movie or a TV show. And so that, combined with the panel format of graphic novels, kind of brought some of my storyboarding interest back into it. And so it kind of became a natural thing that I drifted toward because I still really like storyboarding and I learned a lot, and there are a lot of transferable skills from storyboarding to making comics.
Mhm.
It's just every panel is closer to an illustration or closer to a standalone drawing than it would be in storyboarding, which encourages things to be very rough and very placeholder, you know.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it kind of, and I've had friends and colleagues tell me for years, like, oh, you should do a comic, you should do comics. Your style's very, it feels very, you know, comic-y. And I was
Mm.
just like, oh yeah, maybe, but I don't know how to draw everything. And comic people, they are really good at drawing all the things. And so maybe when I get really, really good, then I'll try doing a comic. And joke's on me, you actually comic artists learn as they go.
Yeah.
No
Well,
comic artist, no
and
comic
and
artist knows how to do it all when they
oh,
start.
start. Sure. Well, and I would say now that I have seen your first graphic novel, you're very good at drawing all the things.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'm just I have to ask how is your injury? Are you fully recovered?
For the most part, it's not as bad as it was. It definitely, while I was working on the graphic novel, especially in the crunch mode of having to churn out 10 to 20 pages a week and doing all
Mhm.
of that intensive work, it flares up every so often, but I've been very diligent about I do a lot of hand stretches, I do a lot of like little hand weights, you know. I lift with hand weights. I have been swimming a lot more, which was something that my physical therapist had actually recommended that I do. And
Mhm.
that's been really helpful because swimming has a quality of providing enough resistance in such a gentle way that you're able to stretch those muscles without really like
Mhm.
overtaxing them, I guess.
Yeah.
So doing that and taking a lot of breaks have really helped me to recover a lot more. And it still shows up every so often,
Mhm.
but now that I've adjusted my workflow, because I had to adjust the way I held my pen, I had to adjust the way I used shortcuts.
Wow.
I had to change a lot about the way that I worked, but because of those changes, that's really helped my hand a lot and
Yeah.
helped
And-
me to keep doing what I'm doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, all right. Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about this book. So when I first picked it up, I expected to read a creepy, fun ghost story. And your book is creepy and it's fun. And as I said in the intro, it is also just so much more. I was surprised and I loved how delightful and thoughtful it is. So to help the listeners get a better sense of this unique story, can you give us a quick summary or your elevator pitch of about your book?
Yes, so the Ghostkeeper is based in a fantasy flavored reimagining of 1890s Edinburgh, Scotland. So kind of a Victorian vibe, and it is about a therapist for ghosts. His name's Dorian. He goes from house to house, and people will recruit him for if they've got a ghost haunting their house, he'll go to various manors and instead of exorcising the ghost, he sits them down and says, "Tell me about your problems. Tell me why you're haunting this house. Why are you angry? Why are you restless?" And he essentially helps them to work through their emotional baggage and whatever that they have that's kind of anchoring them to the living world and preventing them from moving forward and finding peace. And he helps them to find that peace. But as he grows more in notoriety and more ghosts start to come to him with their problems, it becomes very taxing on his mental health too, as the therapist and as the caretaker of these ghosts. And so it's very much a love letter to the quote unquote the therapist friend who
Mm,
like is used to being a source of comfort and help for others, but they don't really know how to take care of themselves and how to be kind to themselves because they give so much of themselves to other people. It may manifest as work-life balance, it may manifest as trauma or just or mental illness or what have you. There's different ways that that can manifest, but it's very much a story about someone who wants to help so much that it kind of affects his health very
mhm.
deeply, and him learning how to make it not affect his health as badly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Dorian is such a great character that I know everyone who picks up the book is going to care deeply about and also care about his mental and emotional health right along with him. Well, so yeah, so this book is about mental health and self-care um and you put together this story in such a brilliant and very accessible way, I think. Um, how did you decide to write about these things in the context of the afterlife? And and can you tell us more about your thought process in creating a story where, there's both the living world and those, moving toward the next thing.
Yes. So in my reading of various ghost stories, ghost fiction, ghost fantasy, um, and horror just in general, there's a lot about things that you regret and reaching a point of no return after which you can no longer fix or atone for or create restitution for things that you've done or things that have happened to you. That features very heavily in ghost stories. And so while I was working on the Ghostkeeper, I was struggling with a lot of that myself because I was thinking, okay, how do I contextualize this in a way where I don't just tell people this is what the afterlife is and this is a definitive answer, but I also create a way for people to kind of conceptualize a kinder vision of the afterlife because I feel like a lot of people, uh, whether religious or secular, will look at the afterlife as kind of a boogeyman or kind of
Mm,
oh, this is the point at which I get punished for what I do
mhm,
in this life. This is the point at which I can no longer take back anything. I can no longer apologize. I can no longer this and that. And it can be kind of a source of potential shame and guilt,
mm,
thinking about what might become of you in whatever comes after this life. And so my motivation for creating the lore and the world building of the Ghostkeeper in the context of the afterlife was a vision of, hey, this is a place that exists that's a neutral zone, and whatever suffering you endure in this neutral zone is the suffering that you bring with you versus something that's inflicted upon you,
mm,
because that is a huge part of mental illness too. Not that it's self-inflicted, but that it's something that we carry with us and something that is kind of created in our minds based on traumas that happen to us, based on experiences that we have, based on misfirings of brain chemistry and individual struggles and individual health issues. Like sometimes we can experience something that is completely from an outside factor that causes us to really struggle, but oftentimes it is also it is incumbent upon us to create our own healing. Nobody can definitively do that for us. And so I wanted to create a through line there of this is something that happened to you that is beyond your control.
mm,
And I know it sucks. Here's how you cope with it. Here's how you move forward. but ultimately you can't really rely on somebody to fix it for you. You
Mm-hmm.
have to find your own way to move forward and your own way to find peace. And so for me, the afterlife, it brought me comfort to think of the afterlife as an extension of that, of just
Mm-hmm.
like all the stuff that bothered you in the living world will still be with you in the afterlife, but it's not existing as a punishment to you. It's existing as, hey, this was something that you were holding on to. Give yourself permission to let it go.
Yeah, yeah. And the letting go is yeah, such a big part of your story. And yeah, and again, I just thought it was brilliant how in reading the book, we're seeing the ghosts processing the things they're carrying with them at the same time, watching Dorian sort through his his mental health concerns as well.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, like ghosts are still people, right? Like it's easy to think of ghosts as these spooky creatures who only want to terrorize, but the impetus and the general conceit of the Ghostkeeper is the idea that ghosts are
Yeah,
people. Ghosts have the same issues that living people do. They have the same concerns, the same regrets. And there's a
yeah,
lot that the ghosts and the living people can kind of learn from each other and learn about each other.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah,
Well, and I think too, it also for me, you know, it also made me think too about how, you know, anytime we meet anybody, it's easy to assume certain things, and just a reminder that all of us, you know, living or ghosts, have have our backstories and all the things that we bring with us. Yeah. Um,
exactly. And the idea that the struggle of life is what you experience, but the afterlife is kind of that's where you find peace and that's where you find rest, but not because it's designed that way, because you have to let go of the things that you struggle with and that cause you pain, and then you will find peace having let that go in
mhm,
this space.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, as I said, there's so much in this book. Um, Um, all right, well, let's talk about the art in this graphic novel. Your art in The Ghostkeeper is so rich and so beautiful, and it captures many different types of scenes and many kinds of emotions. Um, so I'm wondering, were there any scenes or characters that were more challenging for you to create than others?
In terms of characters, I don't know that there were any challenging characters because characters are kind of my forte. I really like designing characters. I really like drawing people. I would say the backgrounds and the environments were probably the hardest part. Um, and actually I went on a research trip to Edinburgh, Scotland and London, and I used that as an opportunity to collect visual reference. I took photos of every edifice, every cobblestone, every chair and desk and lamp that I could find. And that helped me inform me because I wasn't really used to drawing those kinds of things. But because of the setting that I chose, it was kind of, a grave I dug for myself because it was basically doing hard mode. Just like it's gonna be a Victorian location with bookshops and just bookshelves galore and bedrooms, and it's just it's so much, and it's the kind of thing that you can't really find in the wild here in America.
Mm,
And
hmm.
so it helped a lot for me to be able to go to places like Edinburgh and be able to get a feel for how the city was laid out, how the streets are laid out, and also going to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London helped a lot too, because they've got a lot of Victorian era furniture and costumes and various little trinkets on display and silverware and coats and hats and sort of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it helped me a lot to create a visual catalog of what I wanted to create for the book. And I mean, of course, my advice wouldn't just be like, oh, just go to another country. It's easy.
Yeah.
It was very much a situation of circumstance where a bunch of friends were going to be going, and they were like, hey, do you want to come too? And I was like, oh my gosh, how did you know I was
This,
doing? Yes, I'll go.
yeah, win-win.
Yeah, exactly. It ended up being this very rare convergence of a win-win because the setting and the place that they were going to coincided perfectly with me working on the book and me working within that specific setting. So I think that was kind of the hardest part of the book was just anything that wasn't a character.
Mm.
But also
And
I think the comics medium is also a bit difficult to adapt to because you have to uh, plan for the presence of speech bubbles. And you have to anticipate, okay, some of that's going to be covering up the art. And so you have to create something that's detailed enough that it conveys what it's supposed to convey, but not so detailed that you do all this work and then it gets covered up by a bunch of speech bubbles, right?
right. Yeah, I had never thought about that. So you really do have to think about how to leave space for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very unique medium that way
Hmm.
because you can't treat it like a storyboard and you can't treat it like an illustration. It's kind of this in-between zone, which allows for a lot of freedom. There's a lot of creative freedom to be found in the way you set up the panels and the way you depict characters, and you can create some nice visual cues that
Hmm.
bring out emotions in a way that a static drawing or a shot by shot, storyboard would create and evoke in the reader.
Hmm.
But it's tricky. It
Yeah.
it was very much a learning experience, and it was kind of a crucible of figuring out how to work within this medium and having not really done it before in earnest, but then just being handed a deadline and be like, okay, go do it. You said it would be about 250 pages. Joke's on me, it was 272. But yeah, it's like, okay, go for it. Can you have them done by September? It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, 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 wow. Okay, so the non people parts were the challenging parts for creating.
hmm
What did you most enjoy creating in the Ghostkeeper?
Oh gosh. I mean, doing the doing the interactions between the characters was a lot of fun, and I actually really liked the thumbnailing stage where I was just barely laying out, okay, this is what all of the panels are going to look like. This is how basically kind of a rough draft of what each comic page is going to look like. I really enjoyed that, and being able to take it from there to finish was a lot of fun. I also really enjoyed writing for Dorian. Well, I mean, I liked writing for Dorian, and I also didn't like writing for Dorian because he was very much kind of me coded in a
Mm,
lot of ways. I was writing from direct experience in many ways. So stuff that he experiences occasionally were things that I experienced in my life. And so reliving that and recreating that was a little
mm,
difficult emotionally sometimes. And there were parts of the story where I was just like cry drawing because it was just such a emotionally difficult scene for me to do because I remembered what it was like going through it
mm,
and just kind of having to create a resolution for the characters that I feel like I haven't gotten in my own life yet, if that
oh,
makes sense.
yeah, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so
Mm,
it was tough. It's tough to work in such a mercurial subject as ghosts and afterlife and that sort of thing, and like mental and emotional rot, as it were, because those are such abstract things that a lot of people still kind of have a disagreement on whether they're real, whether they're a big deal, whether they affect our daily lives, etc. Some
Yeah.
people believe in ghosts, some people don't believe in ghosts. And so it was difficult to write about it in a way that I felt like would be perfectly relatable to everybody. And so I tried to focus mostly on the mental health aspect because that is something that everybody can relate to. And it's enough of an analog that it gets the message across. But yeah, it's tough to write about those sensitive topics, especially when you have a direct connection with some of it, because
Mhm.
it does kind of feel like reliving reliving a little T trauma in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I will say, I mean, I do feel like writing about mental health through the perspective of ghosts, I think actually makes it a much I think for some people it'll make that conversation around mental health much easier to to think about and talk
Mhm.
about. And yeah.
I agree because I think setting it up as ghosts creates a degree of separation
Yeah, yeah.
so that people can feel like they can let their guard down a little bit as they're reading because they're
Mhm.
thinking, oh, it's a fantasy. Oh, it's a fantasy. Oh, wait, this particular part relates
I can
directly
relate
to
to that.
me.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of the cool thing about comics is it's a little disarming that way. It can handle very heavy subjects in a way that feels like it softens the blow a little bit and is a little bit buffered compared to what you might encounter in a prose novel or even a children's book because comics bridges that gap between children's book
Yeah.
and quote unquote adult
Yeah,
prose
yeah.
novel
And
because
well,
they can be encountered with all ages.
sure, sure, yeah. And I would also say that in a graphic novel, like emotionally, there's so much you can also convey because of your illustration. And yeah, so
Exactly.
it's a powerful way to tell some stories for sure. Um,
Exactly.
well, so I also I love any book that includes references to food. And so in your book, scones are a source of both connection and comfort. And you include a recipe that has a tie-in to the story. So I'm just curious, tell us a little bit more about why you decided to include scones, and the recipe in this in the Ghostkeeper.
Yeah, I mean, for the reason that you stated before, because scones are considered comfort food, particularly in that era, they are a source of connection and comfort, like you said. And so I wanted to create that as like a bonding moment for Dorian and Lucy, Dorian and Brody, and just kind of creating a thing through which they can come together and enjoy something together. And it's something that it's a gesture that both the living and the dead can appreciate, is just existing within the ritual space of,
Mhm.
eating scones, eating a meal, having dessert together, and just kind of taking a break from the world and creating that space, as it were.
Mhm.
And the recipe is actually kind of a funny story because I had a very old book. I collect old books as much as I can when it's not prohibitively expensive to do so. But I had an old book. It was called Instructions in Cookery,
Oh, uh-huh,
by Mrs. E. Briggs. I
uh-huh.
believe it was written in about 1890 something, 1890s, but it's pretty much a primer for how to cook for people who just are starting from scratch and have no idea. I think it might have been used for schools, like teaching younger kids or
Mm,
adolescents, maybe training for kind of one of those proto home
yeah.
economics
So maybe kind of the
primers.
joy of cooking for the
Kind of.
1800s.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Kind of the joy of cooking as and it Man, it was really interesting because I wanted to use a recipe that was as authentic to the Victorian era as possible so I could visually depict all the ingredients that go into it. And also, I thought it would be kind of fun to just recreate a very old recipe and see if I could still, if it's still held up today.
Yeah.
Problem was that particular recipe book, it didn't account for modern day ovens. It basically
Oh,
was like,
interesting.
yeah, basically it instructs, oh, yes, you light your oven and you wait until it is quite hot. And then you put the scones in and you wait until the scones are quite golden brown. And so they're all very, very vague because, ovens only had one setting back then. It was either lit or it wasn't. So I did have to kind of Frankenstein it together with scraps of more modern day scone recipes, like stuff you'd find from like the BBC or various other
Uh-huh.
locations. And I had to talk to some friends across the pond, as it were, because they have different measurements and different ways that their ovens work, like different heat settings than we do in the United States. And so I wanted to create a recipe that was translatable across both,
Uh-huh.
because I didn't want to just be like, oh, this is a Victorian novel, but I'm going to make everything completely American coded.
Yeah, yeah. So you did some adapting there.
Yeah, I had to do some adapting, but I did try out the recipe and it worked out pretty good. It's
Awesome.
it is pretty tasty. So
So
it is something that you can make if you
yeah,
were to follow it beat by beat.
yeah, yeah. Well, so then even there's more to the recipe that's included in this book than first meets the eye. So that's great.
Mhm.
Um, so Johanna, is there anything else you really want readers to know about your book?
Oh gosh.
Or I would
Um,
say if there's one, if there's one takeaway you would love for readers to
mhm.
go away with after reading your book.
Yeah, I would say that really the main takeaway would be to be kind to yourself, as kind to yourself as you would to a friend that was struggling, and give yourself time and space, both time and space within pain and time and space away from it. You don't have to be trapped in suffering. You don't have to be trapped in whatever pain has been created either by external forces or internal forces. Those are very important emotions to have, and it's okay that you're feeling them, but it's okay to let them go, and you need to give yourself permission to let it go and be able to move forward with your
Mhm.
life, because ultimately that is where you're going to find peace. And of course, none of this is meant to be like prescriptive per se, but it invites readers to take on the perspective of maybe I need to be a little more patient with myself. Maybe I need to be more patient with other people, but not to my own expense and detriment and sacrifice, because I'm important too. I need to treat myself kindly, because sometimes the world isn't going to be kind to you, so you need to be kind to you,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And just the idea of finding community where you can. Like, family is important, friends are important, but you'd often be surprised at where you find common ground with people,
Mhm.
and to use that as a source of support as well. Just finding where you can relate to the people around you, creating little pockets of community as needed, which I think in today's world is so, so important, because things have become so polarized and so, in some places, it's a very scary world.
Mhm.
And so it's very much a reminder to pay attention to who's around you, who might need help, and be a source of support for them, but also be a source of support for you, and create those relationships that aren't just take, 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 that are able to give and also have a bit of a balance there in terms of giving and taking on an even playing field as opposed to an imbalance or a codependency.
Mhm. Yeah, such helpful messages for all of us, and all delivered through a wonderful, delightful story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have one more question. Although I see Raven has left the room. Johanna's cat Raven has left
She
the
has
room.
left. She has left. She's
But
sleeping in my.
so there's also this wonderful cat Muffin in the story.
Mhm.
Is Raven the inspiration? Are there connections there?
So actually, there's another cat in the book that was based on Raven.
Oh, okay.
Brody's little bookshop cat, Shadow, is in there, and
Oh,
she has a
okay.
lot of interactions with Muffin, but Muffin was based on my mom's cat. She just turned 20 years old this year.
Wow.
She is a Norwegian forest cat slash ragdoll slash Maine Coon, we think. Kind of one of those mystery long-haired breeds. That's definitely not the standard long hair, but when we had gotten her from the shelter, like many years ago, she was already considered a senior cat. And they were just saying, I don't
And
know. I
and
don't know
and
what they
now
are.
and now even more senior.
It's true. Yes, she is definitely the most senior cat we've had in our family to date, and we've had a lot of cats in our family. We're very much a cat family.
Yeah.
But yeah, Muffin was the source of inspiration because I feel like animals are very important sources of comfort and companionship. And I just personally really like cats. But I also loved the idea of a ghost cat who causes mischief not on purpose, but just is doing cat things, but they're translating as poltergeist activity, like knocking a candlestick off the mantelpiece. It's just
Right.
like that's a classic cat behavior, but people would look at it and be
And
like, "Oh
go,
my gosh, a
"Ah, a
ghost."
ghost. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah, so she was the inspiration for that.
yeah. All right. Well, so many wonderful things about this book. Again, congratulations, Johanna, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Holly. Yeah, it was wonderful to get a chance to meet and talk with you too.
Everyone, pick up Ghostkeeper. You will enjoy it.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!